Hello and welcome to another episode of Pioneer Valley Life. I'm your host, James Sullivan. We're here in the studios of Easthampton's eMedia. Today my guest is Michael Garjian. Welcome.
Thank you very much, James. Nice to see you again.
Yep.
Happy to be here.
Good. Happy to have you. You're a Easthampton resident, but I know you've been around the Pioneer Valley for a long time.
I did. I came out in '64 to go to the university.
Yeah.
And studied physics for a while. I really wanted to be an inventor and realized that physics really wasn't going to work for me because that tells you what all the rules are, and inventors are generally trying to break the rules. So
Right.
I went through, did some engineering, some science, business management, and came out of there and stayed in the valley since then. It's such a wonderful place to be, actually.
Yeah.
Irene and I did leave for a while just to kind of do some technology development work out in Los Angeles. We lived in Hollywood for a while, but all roads lead back to the valley.
They do, yeah. I've been through that a lot. I always seem to end up there, you know.
Yeah.
Although around this time of year is when I question those decisions.
Yes, it is.
When it's snow and cold, but it's not been bad this year.
Though, you know, we're talking about climate. Biochar has a lot to do with climate, how to help with the problem. And the National Audubon Society did a study years back, and they said over the next 25 to 30 years, by the time we get around to 2030, 2035, the climate in the valley is going to, or in the Northeast, is going to look more like North and South Carolina. So I think we're beginning to see a transition now, particularly this winter.
Yeah. So I haven't introduced your business yet, so you're here to tell us about Carbon Star. And from the website, I picked up some notes here. It said the Carbon Star mobile catalytic vacuum pyrolysis system is the result of 16 years of research and development. The mission statement says to enable individuals, municipalities, and companies to share in the $100 trillion CO2 removal industry. So we're talking about removing carbon from the environment, correct?
From the atmosphere, yes.
From the atmosphere, yeah.
And the oceans, too.
Yeah, okay. And what is it about carbon that needs to be, why it needs to be gotten rid of? So
the carbon dioxide is a warming gas. So in other words, if you took a balloon full of carbon dioxide and a balloon full of the atmosphere, and you put heat on both of them, you would see that the carbon dioxide will hold more heat than the atmospheric gases. And so as carbon dioxide builds up in the atmosphere, as it has been doing since 1850, it's been increasing the temperature of the planet. And now we've risen between 1.3 degrees centigrade and 1.5 above 1850 levels. And that level is important because that was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when we really began taking fossil fuels out of the ground, burning them, and putting additional new carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Right. Normally we have a carbon cycle on the planet, and the way the carbon cycle works is biomass, plants, forests, algae, all living matter, plant life, absorbs CO2 and gives off oxygen. Then when that plant matter dies, that CO2 through microbial action, that carbon that the plant retained, converts back to CO2 and goes back into the atmosphere, unless a tree, for instance, falls and rots in water. And at that point, it's putting methane back into the atmosphere. So basically, as carbon dioxide is absorbed by biomass, oxygen is given out. When the biomass dies, the carbon dioxide is returned. And that's been going on for hundreds of thousands of years, which keeps the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere level. Once you start taking coal and fossil fuels out of the ground and burn them, you're adding new carbon dioxide, and that's what raises it. So now we're up to 418 parts per million by volume in the atmosphere, whereas in 1850 we were down around 250. So in order to maintain what they're now saying is 2 degrees, because remember, we were talking about 1.5 for a number of years, and now they're beginning to admit that's not going to happen. In order to maintain 2 degrees to 2.4 degrees, we need to not only stop putting CO2 into the atmosphere, which is called net zero, but we also need to remove 1 trillion tons of the CO2 that we've already put into the atmosphere. And that means we need to be pulling 70 billion tons a year out every year, 14 billion tons a year, excuse me, every year for the next 70 years. And there we have a shot at keeping the planet at a level of 2 to 2.4 degrees temperature rise. That's centigrade.
Right.
So that is not good news, but it's better than 7 or 8 degrees, which is what would happen if we do nothing.
If you do nothing, yeah.
If we do nothing,
right.
yes.
So you have come up with a process that takes biomass, which you explained is living matter, and convert it to something called biochar.
Yes, correct.
And biochar, I saw the term charcoal used, when describing it. So it's, and the sample that you showed me, and the sample of it coming out of the machine, it does look a bit like charcoal.
It looks very much like charcoal, but it has additional very significant properties, and it more is similar to activated carbon than charcoal. And that is because biochar carries an electrical charge, and it also has a huge amount of surface area. So if you had a teaspoon of biochar, which is equal to about 3 grams, you could have a surface area as large as 2.5 football fields of surface area. And that surface area is electrically active, and that will adsorb, not absorb, but it adsorbs. It's an electrical connection, like a magnet. It will adsorb toxic metals from the soil. It'll absorb PFAS, forever chemicals now, from biosolid streams, because a lot of this material is being put back into the river, the effluents from these wastewater treatment plants, and they're testing for a couple of metals, but you have all the pharmaceuticals that are going back in, you have the forever chemicals that are going back in because they're not required to test for those yet, but the biochar will pull all of those because of its electrical activity. And when you put it in soil, it will also detoxify tainted soils, but in addition, because of its large surface area, it has an enormous amount of area for microbes to live in where the nematodes can't eat them. And by creating that biochar with microbes, and rock dust is very helpful also, mixing that in the soil, you can actually renew depleted lands and bring back the living life in the soil. And as far as using biomass, the biomass we really want to use is dead biomass. So when the tree rots, we know that it's going to put carbon and methane back into the atmosphere. However, if we take that tree before it has a chance to rot, it's dead now, and we run it through our system, that vaporizes all of the cellulose and the hemicellulose and the lignins in the wood, and it leaves behind the basic carbon that the tree or the biomass had absorbed. So then we condense the vapors, and those produce bio-oils, which can be used to displace fossil fuels. And those oils are carbon negative if you burn them. Now, if you mix them with asphalt for the highway, they also are permanently sequestering that carbon in the earth. So you've now been able to remove significant amounts of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And this is a bag of biochar. It's very black. We can't get the camera to it, but we have some pictures. And this used to be atmospheric CO2. It's now solid carbon. And so we need to be removing that material, particularly because the dead biomass in our forests is not being removed. Years ago, environmentalists were saying you can't take that out, you're going to compact the forest floor, you should leave it in there to add nutrients to the soils. But what's happened is that material has built up significantly, so much so that that's leading to the wildfires. That's the fuel that fuels these massive wildfires. So in Canada, for instance, the biomass, the dead biomass, I call it DDB for convenience, dead decaying biomass. There's more dead decaying biomass in those forests up there, about 2,100 tons per acre, compared to living biomass of 800 tons per acre. And that's what helped drive these forest fires. And what happened is, because of the burning, that puts the carbon back into the atmosphere too. Those forest fires between May, when they began, about the middle of May, to the end of June, 6 weeks, they had already emitted more CO2 into the atmosphere than the entire country of Canada does in 1 year.
Oh.
And now, at this point, that fire season ended in November. Those fires have emitted more CO2 than 138 countries. But not only the CO2, now you have the pollutants.
Yeah.
And you saw the smoke in the atmosphere.
We saw it down
you saw
here.
the red sun, you're breathing it.
Yeah.
I have friends out in California that were wearing masks in their house. So many, many people were getting sick. So unfortunately, there's a kind of a move to not use biomass in Massachusetts. And in fact, the elected officials, the governor has ceased removing any forest debris from state-owned forests. But unfortunately, it's a bit misguided in that DDB on a planetary scale emits 17 times more CO2 into the atmosphere than all human activity. And you can see that if you Google NASA carbon cycle, you'll see that carbon cycle.
Yeah.
So as we're leaving that material, it's seething CO2. Just drive down any forest road or any wooded road in Western Mass here and look in the woods a couple hundred feet or so, right up to the road. You'll see massive amounts of trees laying down.
Yep.
And if they're in water and you see a swamp, you'll see the bubbles of methane. And methane's 85 times more damaging for the atmosphere than CO2.
Right.
And when methane decomposes, it turns into CO2. So it's a double whammy with methane.
Right.
And so it is essential that we remove this DDB, the dead dying biomass, so that the living trees have more space to grow, the saplings can grow, and we can get the health of our forests back. But the reason we're having all of these biofires, in part, is because of the substantial amount of DDB on forest floors.
Right.
California fires in 2018, there was 169 million tons of DDB on forest floors. Those fires burned only 18 million tons, destroying 13,000 homes, hundreds of lives, millions of animals, polluting thousands of square feet unnecessarily.
Yeah.
And so now we need to get to work doing that. And the Carbon Star system is one of the most effective ways to do it.
So you said you started 16 years ago, research and development. How did you first come up with the idea that ends up with this machine?
Well, I began earlier in working in alternative fuels. So I began working with a young fellow from Hampshire, Justin Carvin, who developed grease cars, and we were running automobiles on vegetable oil. And so that kind of was my first real step into the environmental. Previous, I had developed some light sources that use very little energy to produce significant amounts of light. And so we go back even further, but the environmental began back in 2002, 2003. And as I went on, I became familiar with the process of pyrolysis through my research and development, and as a result became one of the earliest advocates for pyrolysis in the United States. There were a handful of us back in 2006 talking about biochar. Right. Now everybody's talking about biochar in the climate community.
Right. And the pyrolysis is the process from which the biomass is converted to biochar.
Yeah, and that's very important in that what our system does is we place you've seen the system, basically the biomass is placed into a heated vacuum chamber. In my case, it's a 28-foot-long tube, 12 inches in diameter, and it's under a vacuum, so there's no oxygen in that tube. And we introduce the biomass through airlocks to preserve that oxygen, that vacuum, and that tube is heated along its length and has got a screw inside which pulls it through the tube, through the different heat zones, and as it moves through those heat zones and gets hot, it drives off all of the volatiles. It's called depolymerization. We use a catalyst. So the long chain hydrocarbons, which are cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignins, those long chain hydrocarbons, and a hydrocarbon chain is simply a string of carbon atoms with hydrogens attached to both sides. So you can have one carbon atom with two hydrogens, two more on the ends, so you can have CH4, that's methane. Then you add another carbon and two more hydrogens, you get ethane, then propane, and then pentane. And then you move up, nonane is kerosene, 8 carbons, octane. And as these chains get longer, they go from very light gases to heavier gases, then to light oils, to heavier oils. Then as those chains get very long, you get into plastics. And that's so we break those long cellulose chains into shorter chains. So out of cellulose, we can produce ethane, methane, propane, those types of gases. And we can also produce oils, the heavy oils, as the chains are longer. So what we get when we put the biomass into the vacuum chamber, we get the solid carbon, then we get two fractions, weights, a heavy oil and a light oil of biofuels or bio-oils. We really don't want them used as fuels. What we want to do with these oils is mix them with asphalt for highways. So that will sequester that and permanently keep it out of the atmosphere. But if we were to burn it, it would not add new CO2 into the atmosphere. And then you have the gases, and those gases will be compressed, and we can use those to produce heat. So ultimately, it's an emission-free process. There's no combustion at all. We're not burning anything. We're simply heating it in a vacuum, and that allows us to pull the hydrocarbons out.
Right.
And so that's how we move that material through the system.
So that system that you have there, where is that located?
Well, this is in Holyoke now. And so this, I first began working in pyrolysis systems back in 2006. And eventually got involved in building large-scale systems. The last one I built was a 70-foot vacuum chamber. And that was moved out of the country by the investors, and I went in a different direction because I thought it was more important to have mobile units. So this essentially is a mobile unit. It can be moved, and it produces the biochar, the bio-oils, and the biogases can then be used to generate power, to generate electricity to run the system. So essentially what we're looking to create is a completely sustainable system, self-sustaining, that can be put anywhere on the planet where there's feedstock, and where there isn't, there are certain feedstocks that grow. And if you have that feedstock, then you can have electricity, you can have heat, you can have carbon for your water and cleaning, and so anywhere on the planet. So these can act as the power supply for microgrids in even remote areas.
Right.
And the interesting thing here is not only do we want to use the dead, dying, decaying biomass from forests, but I'm very interested in using seaweed, because you've read this summer the millions and millions of tons of sargassum. We have samples of that now, and we can produce biochar and oils from that. And so now we're also pulling CO2 out of the ocean as well as out of the atmosphere. And that's particularly important too, James, because the oceans are becoming acidified, they're becoming warmer. It's affecting the lower levels of the food chain. Crustaceans, small crustaceans, can't form shells, coral. So we need to work with the oceans too. So not only do we want to clean the atmosphere, we also want to clean the oceans. And another thing, finally, that we would really like to do is dead trees are one thing, and we can sequester this system. If we move 7 tons of wood through it a day, we'll sequester more CO2 in 67 hours than an entire acre of mature forest can sequester in a year. So we're sequestering CO2 440 times faster than a tree, while using only 2 or 3% of the biomass in the forest, which is dead laying on the floor.
Right.
So it's a win-win situation for everybody. And the important thing is that we don't want to be cutting living trees. The whole purpose is to make the soils better for them. But another thing we would like to do is grow energy crops in the fallow land. There's 1 million acres of CPA-owned land that nothing is being done with. It's sitting fallow. Median strips on highways, some of these, we could be growing energy crops in collaboration with local farmers to produce thousands and thousands of tons of additional feedstock for pyrolysis systems. So our interest is to actually use crops that grow within 90 days to feed the system. So between those crops and seaweed and dead forest wood, we're one of the most effective ways to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And in fact, we did join Elon Musk's $100 million Carbon X Prize. He put up $100 million for the technologies that are most effective at removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And after the first round of judging, we came in, Carbon Star came in at number 80. And we only showed them a third of the system. We didn't show them the oil and the gases because of technical trade secret at that time. They said you would have done much better. So we now just entered last Friday. Actually, we were entered into the next phase of the competition, so we'll see how that goes. But basically, this system is one of the most effective ways to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And the building we have in Holyoke not only has the capability of allowing us to run our system and do testing and on different feedstocks and things, but we have enough room there to start building systems. And our friends out at MIT tell us there's a need for thousands of these systems, or tens of thousands in some cases, they've said. So we'd like to build an industry here in Holyoke. We chose Holyoke because it is the poorest city in the country, in the state, and one of the poorest, Springfield, Holyoke. And we want to create a base for work, for people here to find jobs and make living wages and own a piece of the company. And so there's a very strong social component. That's why Carbon Star Systems, we incorporated it as a Massachusetts Domestic Benefit Corporation. That's a B Corp. And we've set aside a certain amount of equity to be owned by the community through an economic model that I envisioned years back and got a group of people together. It's called E2M. It's at e2m.org on the website, or you can go to Community Capitalism, where we've set up the structures for communities to earn enormous amounts of money to take care of themselves, rather than being victims of an economic system that's, quite frankly, unsustainable. So there's a couple of levels that this is happening at, and we get what we need when we need it. Our mission is to help people. Our mission is to help communities. Our mission is to give individuals, communities, organizations access to carbon removal technology, which is being subsidized by the government and other private companies at $100 a ton. So there's a huge industry developing, and we want to see it be benefit as many people as possible rather than the handful of elites that control everything right this second. The whole idea is to create economic justice as effectively as we can, and we want to do that by linking the energy system up with the social system through a structure that's community controlled that we share our funds with. So we'll donate up to 10% of the equity of the company to the community and employees as well within the company as it grows.
So the end user for one of these systems, is that a municipality? Is it, you know, because they could benefit from it, or is it a private company?
Both.
Or even, you certainly wouldn't be able to put one of those in your basement or in your garage.
Not yet. We're not going that small. What we wanted to do is pull CO2. So
how long does it take you to build a system like that?
Well, you know, when people ask that question, I say, how long does it take to build an automobile? So if you have 100 people and you've got a production line, you can build an automobile in days. If you're doing it one at a time, it'll take you years. So the way I design this system is composed of all off-the-shelf components. So it's an assembly process. So can we build 100 systems a year? Yes. Can we build 1,000 systems a year? That would take more doing, but really my interest is to build a manufacturing base here in Massachusetts, if we're allowed to, but to license the technology around the world to much larger companies that can take it out and build these like automobiles. And that's really what we need to do. And the royalties coming back from that would benefit local communities around the country. That's our interest.
So I know there's also a biochar business, because you can go on Google and put in biochar and you'll see ads for different companies that produce biochar for the garden industry, for the agricultural industry. So I guess they're using a different process than you use?
Well, there's a number of different, no one has a process like ours. This system is completely computer controlled. So once we build this system, we could put it in a remote jungle and over the internet through Elon Musk's Starlink, we could control that system, monitor it so that the local folks who own it have some technical support. So there's nothing as sophisticated. This is probably the most sophisticated biochar system in the country. What others do is they take the ash from biomass power plants and they call that biochar. But unfortunately, for every ton of carbon produced by that plant, you have to burn 880 tons of, you have to burn 1,200 tons a day of trees, which produces 2,200 tons of CO2. So each ton of carbon from that biomass plant is produced by emitting 880 tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. Others can produce biochar by putting it in a barrel, wood in a barrel, and putting it in a bonfire. And that will produce biochar in the barrel, but the carbon produced by the fire itself exceeds the amount of carbon sequestered by that. And so there's a lot of biochar out there, and some of it is truly carbon negative that really does sequester CO2, as ours does. So for every 67 tons of CO2 this system puts out in moving wood from the forest to the final market and the electricity we use, for every 67 tons of CO2, we sequester 367 tons of CO2 from the atmosphere, giving us a net 3 tons of CO2. 300 tons of CO2. So that's the big difference between us and a number of other biochars, and that's coming to roost soon, because there are organizations now that recognize that some people are selling what they call biochar and saying it's sequestering CO2 when it really isn't. So these standards are coming up now, and so we'll see how that goes down the road.
Well, we've covered an awful lot of territory here in just this half hour.
We have.
And obviously you're very knowledgeable about what you're doing. A listener at home, a viewer at home, they can go to your website,
Yes.
www.carbonstar.systems,
Yeah.
and learn more about the process.
Yes.
Learn more about why you're doing this, why it should be done in the world, not only by you, but by others.
Absolutely.
That there is definitely a benefit to actually, promoting this process that you have developed.
Yes.
And, so hopefully people will go and learn more. And if they know that there's actually something happening here in the Pioneer Valley, perhaps they'll learn more. Maybe you'll be speaking at different places.
I would like to get back. I've been on the road previously, but I've been in I call it a cave for the past 5 years building this system. But as we are here, I'm beginning to get out. And our company, what I did is I licensed the Carbon Star process to New England, to a company, E3 LLC, and that's the company that actually funded the equipment here, and I'm a principal in that company, my partner and I, and so E3 LLC is the local organization that will be building systems and producing biochar for the New England region and beyond.
Good.
And the next step is to license around the world.
Great. Well, as I said, that's an awful lot to digest.
Yeah, it is.
But, if people have an interest in it, they can go to your website. They can contact you about more information about the system.
They can.
They can, maybe invite you to come to a meeting of some group to explain what you explained here today.
I'd love to do it, whether it's schools. Young folks need to know what's happening out there, and they need to know how they can be helpful, and they need to be given hope too. When you listen to a lot of what's being said, the end of human civilization, et cetera, et cetera.
Those are not good words to hear.
They're not good words to hear. I mean, when we were kids, all we had to do was worry about Russian missiles raining down from the skies.
Right.
Now they're telling these young kids, you may not be around 50 years from now.
Yeah.
And so we really need to show these young folks, because they're our future, how they can be a really proactive, strong force in saying, no, we're not going to accept that. We're going to do something about it. We have the strength, we have the power, we have the time, and we're going to do it. And if I can do anything to help those young people understand who they are and what their purpose is and how to do what they need to do to have a wonderful life, then that's what I'm here for.
Great. Well, thanks very much for being here, Michael.
Thank you.
Really the website will be available at the end of the show. The slide will go up with contact information, and if somebody wants to contact you, they can go to your website and they'll find out more information there.
And they can also, if they're interested in the economic component, they could go to communitycapitalism.com, and there's some videos on there.
Yeah.
And essentially that is a site that shows how we can create a structure, or how we have created a structure that allows the community as an entity to use the tool of capitalism, the most wealth concentrating tool in the history of humanity. How can communities use that tool, just like corporations are doing, to create huge amounts of economic power for themselves? So they're as powerful as corporations, and we can begin to operate on a level playing field with some of these very large corporations who are mucking up the planet here.
Right.
And that's really part of the key of getting to the future that we all want and that we can all have.
Great.
It's ours for the taking. That's what I like to say in the book. There's a book there on that website. It's free. I'm not trying to sell books. You can download the PDF. But that's what we need to do. We all need to get together, and we all need to say enough is enough, and we can move forward, and we can really take the future that we want. But don't let the doomsayers put you under a dark cloud. It is possible to do what needs to be done, and we're going to do it.
Great. Well, thanks very much for being here, Michael.
You're welcome. I appreciate talking to you, James.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again.